Imagine waking up one morning to a world where every single insect has mysteriously vanished overnight. The soft buzzing of bees, the chirping of crickets, the fluttering of butterflies, all silenced in an instant. For many of us, the initial reaction might be one of relief. No more mosquitoes buzzing around our ears, no more ants invading our kitchens, and no more flies pestering our picnics. It might even feel like a dream come true, a chance to enjoy a cleaner, more peaceful world. But as the initial euphoria fades, a darker reality begins to emerge. Insects are not mere nuisances. They are the hidden architects of our natural world, holding together systems that sustain life as we know it. In today's exploration, we're about to uncover what would really happen if all insects disappeared tomorrow. From the eerie silence that would envelop our natural spaces to the devastating effects on agriculture, food supplies, ecosystems, and even our sense of self, the impact would be far more profound than most could imagine. If you're intrigued by the mysteries of nature and the invisible threads that bind us to other species, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Let's step into a world without insects and see just how dependent we are on these tiny, often overlooked creatures. The first thing you'd notice in a world without insects is the silence. Step outside, and the usual background hum of life would be gone. The soft, almost comforting drone of bees hovering over flowers, the steady chirping of crickets in the evening, the flash of a firefly on a summer night. Silent. Forests, gardens, and parks would feel strangely empty, almost lifeless. This eerie stillness wouldn't just be unsettling, it would profoundly alter our connection to nature. Imagine taking a walk through a forest. Without the small sounds of insects, even the rustle of leaves would sound louder, almost echoing through the trees. Birdsong might persist for a while, but many bird species would quickly disappear too, as they rely on insects for food. The quiet would be a stark reminder of how interconnected life is and how insects have woven themselves into the very fabric of nature's soundtrack. For centuries, humans have lived with these sounds as part of our environment's ambient music. The absence of this natural chorus could lead to a phenomenon called solastalgia, a form of environmental grief or nostalgia for the way things once were. This emotional void would be profound, affecting our mental and emotional well-being, reminding us of the unseen work these tiny creatures do to make nature feel vibrant and alive. One of the most devastating consequences of an insect-free world would be the collapse of pollination systems. Insects, especially bees, are vital for the pollination of approximately 75% of the world's flowering plants, including over 1/3 of global food crops. Without bees and other pollinators, plants would struggle to reproduce, and humanity's food supply would be at risk. This disappearance would set off a cascade of food shortages as entire agricultural industries would be thrown into chaos. Consider the crops that would be most affected. Fruits like apples, oranges, and strawberries, nuts such as almonds, and vegetables like tomatoes and cucumbers. All would see dramatic decline. Coffee, chocolate, and many spices also depend on insect pollination, and their scarcity would impact diets and economies worldwide. Artificial pollination might sound like a solution, but it's slow, labor-intensive, and costly. Large-scale efforts to pollinate crops by hand or through machines would be inefficient, unable to match the speed and precision of natural insect pollinators. The economic impact on farmers and the food industry would be immense. Agriculture would become more labor-intensive and expensive, leading to higher prices for consumers and reduced availability of many foods. Experts estimate that insect pollination contributes billions of dollars to the global economy each year. Without insects, economies that rely heavily on crop exports would suffer significant losses, and food prices would skyrocket. affecting people around the world. The very structure of our agricultural systems, built on the reliability of insect pollination, would need a complete overhaul. With pollination systems collapsing, the agricultural industry would face unprecedented crises. The disappearance of insects would create food shortages that ripple across every corner of the globe. Staple crops that don't directly rely on insect pollination, like wheat, corn, and rice, might still initially seem unaffected. However, even these crops would ultimately feel the impact due to the interconnected nature of ecosystems. Farmers growing these crops would experience higher costs and competition for resources as agricultural systems crumble around them. In regions dependent on pollinator-reliant crops, entire industries would collapse. Fruits, nuts, and vegetable markets, typically plentiful and accessible, would become rare luxuries. Grocery store shelves would lack familiar items, and diets would have to adjust drastically. Food scarcity would drive up costs, placing a heavy burden on low-income families and leading to further inequality in food distribution. People in densely populated areas would experience sharp price increases for fruits, vegetables, and essential staples. Developing countries, already vulnerable to food insecurity, would be hit hardest. As food production declines, competition for resources could lead to conflicts. Countries that once relied on international trade for crops might impose tariffs or restrictions, creating tension among trading partners. Some experts predict that in the event of massive food shortages, nations could be driven to secure their food supplies through aggressive means. In an insectless world, societies would need to adapt to a significantly altered diet, focusing on whatever food sources can be artificially sustained or supplemented. Meat production, which indirectly depends on crops pollinated by insects, would also suffer, further reducing food options. This global agricultural collapse would create a humanitarian crisis as nations scramble to feed their populations. Insects aren't just pollinators, they're also nature's most efficient decomposers. When plants die, animals perish, or leaves fall, insects play a crucial role in breaking down this organic matter, recycling nutrients, and returning them to the soil. Without insects like beetles, flies, and ants managing this constant cycle of decomposition, dead matter would pile up at an alarming rate. Forest floors would soon be littered with fallen leaves and animal remains, unable to decompose at the usual pace. This massive buildup of organic matter could disrupt soil health and result in widespread nutrient imbalances. The absence of insect decomposers would affect the quality and productivity of the soil itself, making it harder for new plants to thrive. Over time, bacteria and fungi might partially fill the gap left by decomposing insects, but not quickly enough to prevent environmental chaos. The piles of undigested waste would begin to rot, creating foul odors, polluting water sources, and increasing the likelihood of diseases spreading. Without insects to swiftly break down carcasses, bacteria would take over, leading to a potential rise in pathogens dangerous to both animals and humans. Another unforeseen consequence is the increased risk of wildfires. In areas where dry, dead plant matter accumulates unchecked, the risk of fires could skyrocket, especially in hot, dry seasons. With vast amounts of dry material waiting to ignite, even the smallest spark could result in a wildfire of catastrophic proportions. Firefighters and emergency services would be stretched thin, forced to battle blazes fueled by a relentless buildup of flammable materials. The world would see more frequent and devastating wildfires, resulting in habitat destruction and loss of life. Additionally, the cycle of decomposition, which helps maintain carbon levels in the soil and air, would be disrupted, possibly contributing to further environmental instability. This unchecked accumulation of dead material would transform landscapes, reshaping ecosystems as we know them. Rivers and streams, often reliant on clean banks, would become choked with debris, threatening aquatic life and water quality. Cities and rural areas alike would feel the impact as waste and decay pile up with no natural cleanup crew to manage the mess. Insects form the foundation of countless food webs. They're a primary food source for numerous animals, including birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and small mammals. With insects gone, many of these creatures would face starvation, resulting in a cascade of extinctions. Birds, for instance, rely heavily on insects to feed their young, especially during breeding seasons. Without this vital food source, bird populations would decline sharply, affecting species diversity and disturbing ecological balances across regions. Consider fish populations in rivers and lakes. Many species depend on aquatic insects like mayflies, dragonflies, and midges. These insects are a staple for juvenile fish, sustaining them until they grow large enough to catch other prey. If insect larvae vanish from these waterways, fish populations would plummet, affecting commercial fisheries, local communities reliant on fish as a primary protein source, and entire aquatic ecosystems. The absence of insects would also impact predators higher up the food chain. Mammals such as bats, which consume enormous quantities of insects nightly, would face dire food shortages, leading to their eventual decline or extinction. This would, in turn, impact other predators, creating a ripple effect that extends to even the largest carnivores. As each link in the food web collapses, ecosystems would shift unpredictably, potentially leading to the rise of invasive species or unforeseen ecological imbalances. Aquatic environments would also suffer. Insects that serve as bioindicators, organisms whose presence, absence, or abundance reflects a specific environmental condition, play a crucial role in maintaining water quality. Without these insects, not only would fish suffer, but water ecosystems as a whole would experience drastic changes. Algae and plant overgrowth could thrive unchecked without herbivorous insects to manage them, leading to dead zones where oxygen levels drop dangerously low, affecting all forms of aquatic life. The impact of these cascading extinctions would extend to plant life as well. Certain plants rely on specific insect species for pollination, seed dispersal, or leaf decomposition. Without insects, these plants would struggle to survive, resulting in decreased biodiversity and altering entire landscapes. The interconnectedness of species within an ecosystem means that each loss reverberates, causing a chain reaction that could lead to the collapse of ecosystems that have taken millennia to develop. Ultimately, the disappearance of insects could lead to a planet dominated by a handful of hardy species that thrive in nutrient-poor environments, effectively transforming Earth into a much less hospitable place for most forms of life. The economic impact of a world without insects would be profound. Agriculture, one of the sectors most reliant on insect pollination, would face unprecedented challenges. Crops such as apples, almonds, blueberries, and coffee depend heavily on pollinators, and without them, yields would plummet and prices would skyrocket. This drop in crop productivity would lead to widespread food shortages, affecting the supply chain and forcing industries to find costly alternatives to replace the work insects once did for free. Farmers would be hit hard, especially those who rely on insect-pollinated crops. They'd face increased production costs as they attempt to mimic natural pollination through artificial means or rely on manual pollination efforts. Countries that produce large amounts of insect-pollinated crops, like the almond orchards in California, could see their agricultural economies devastated. The financial burden would fall not only on the farming industry, but also on governments and consumers, as they struggle with inflated food prices and diminished availability. Food insecurity would spread, affecting both developed and developing nations. Countries with limited resources to invest in artificial pollination or alternative agricultural methods would be particularly vulnerable. Nations dependent on certain crops for export revenue would suffer economic downturns, creating ripple effects in international trade. Developing nations, where food scarcity is already a critical issue, would face an even graver reality, with millions more at risk of starvation. The tourism industry, especially ecotourism, would experience significant losses. Visitors who travel to experience natural landscapes, view butterflies, fireflies, and other iconic insects would find these experiences diminished or non-existent. Local economies that rely on tourism income would struggle, and regions famed for their biodiversity might lose their unique appeal. Beyond agriculture and tourism, other sectors would incur heavy costs. Waste management and decomposition, tasks largely handled by insects, would require new approaches and technologies to prevent the buildup of organic waste. This would increase municipal expenses and the need for alternative waste management methods, creating economic strain for governments and communities. With these drastic shifts, society would experience notable social consequences. Rising food prices and unemployment in agriculture and tourism sectors could push more people into poverty, particularly in rural and agriculture-dependent regions. Increased food insecurity and economic instability could lead to migration, with families moving in search of food or jobs, possibly triggering conflicts over resources. Moreover, the technological solutions required to address the lack of insects, such as robotic pollinators or advanced waste decomposition systems, come with a hefty price tag, putting immense pressure on research and development sectors. These solutions may take years, even decades, to develop and implement effectively, creating a prolonged period of economic adjustment and resource scarcity. The global economy is delicately interconnected with nature, and the absence of insects would expose vulnerabilities in food production, trade, and resource management. This new reality would force a restructuring of societal norms and economic practices to adapt to the challenges of a world devoid of insects. The disappearance of insects would bring about profound psychological and cultural consequences. Insects are so deeply ingrained in our daily experiences and natural surroundings that their absence would leave a void. The comforting sounds of buzzing bees, chirping crickets, and the visual splendor of butterflies fluttering around would be lost, creating an eerie silence in nature. People who frequent parks, forests, and gardens would immediately feel this change, with the once vibrant living environment transformed into something unnervingly quiet and still. This loss would lead to a phenomenon known as environmental grief. This type of grief occurs when people experience a loss of connection to nature or witness environmental degradation. The absence of insects would undoubtedly trigger such feelings, particularly among those who have spent their lives connected to the natural world, such as farmers, biologists, conservationists, and even children who have grown up observing insects up close. Over time, as the silence persists, there could be a collective sense of nostalgia, longing for the richness of biodiversity that insects once provided. Our relationship with insects goes beyond a functional dependency. Insects have inspired countless myths, legends, and artistic expressions across cultures. Ancient Egyptians saw the scarab beetle as a symbol of rebirth and protection. In Native American cultures, the dragonfly represents transformation and adaptability. These cultural symbols reflect the human connection to insects, recognizing them as vital beings within the broader circle of life. Without insects, we lose these symbolic connections, stripping away layers of cultural meaning and collective identity. The impact would extend into art, literature, and entertainment as well. Works inspired by the natural world would need to adapt to the absence of insects. Nature-themed art might start to reflect a landscape devoid of the insects that have long been part of our visual and emotional experience. Writers, poets, and filmmakers would grapple with depicting a world without insects, shifting narratives that have traditionally included these small but significant creatures as symbols of resilience, community, or transformation. The loss of insects would also affect children's education and connection to nature. Field trips, science classes, and even simple backyard explorations often feature insects as primary subjects for understanding ecosystems, food chains, and biology. Without insects, educators would face challenges in teaching these topics, and future generations might grow up without the direct, hands-on experience of observing insects in their natural habitat. This detachment from nature could lead to a society that views nature as more abstract, reducing empathy for environmental issues and decreasing interest in ecological conservation. Overall, the disappearance of insects would mark a shift in human culture, diminishing the collective appreciation and connection to the natural world. People would be left with memories and stories of a time when insects played a vital role in the world, fueling not only ecosystems but also the human imagination and spirit. As we envision a world without insects, the question arises, could humanity truly adapt to such a radical transformation of the environment? The disappearance of insects would demand a complete restructuring of our systems, technologies, and societies. From food production to waste management, the scale of adaptation required would be unprecedented in human history. In the short term, humans would likely attempt to address the loss of pollination by turning to technology. Robotic pollinators are currently in development and could, in theory, take over the job of pollinating plants. However, the costs of implementing robotic pollination on a global scale would be astronomical. The process would require vast resources, research, and development, making it feasible only for high-value crops. Unfortunately, these technologies are still in their infancy, and even with significant advancements, it would be difficult to achieve the efficiency and scale that natural pollinators provide. To combat the decomposition crisis, humanity might also turn to chemical and mechanical solutions for waste management. Advanced composting systems, artificial decomposition machines, and extensive use of microbial treatments could help break down organic matter. However, these solutions would be costly, energy-intensive, and environmentally taxing. The infrastructure required to replace the natural decomposition work of insects would create additional economic and environmental burdens, increasing the pressure on already strained ecosystems. Beyond technology, societies would face significant economic and social challenges. With food production drastically reduced and certain crops potentially disappearing altogether, humans would have to shift to alternative sources of sustenance. Diets may become more dependent on crops like corn and wheat, which do not rely on insect pollination. But even these plants would be affected by the overall ecological imbalance. To compensate, humans might need to invest heavily in laboratory-grown foods and synthetic alternatives to meet nutritional needs. However, such foods are currently expensive and inaccessible to large portions of the global population. In response to these challenges, global societies might undergo significant restructuring. Countries and communities dependent on agriculture would be forced to adapt to new economic models, potentially transitioning from traditional farming to lab-grown food industries. Cities might develop large-scale vertical farms and aquaponic systems, trying to create controlled environments where some level of sustainable food production could be achieved without the help of insects. The social impacts would also be profound. Many traditional ways of life, particularly in rural and agricultural communities, would become obsolete. Entire industries, including beekeeping, organic farming, and ecological tourism, would collapse. Job displacement on this scale would create economic strain and exacerbate poverty in regions highly dependent on agriculture. Additionally, the psychological and cultural disconnect from nature, coupled with increased urbanization, might lead to a society that views nature as a resource rather than a partner in a balanced ecosystem. In a long-term speculative view, humanity might evolve to adapt to this new reality, futuristic concepts such as genetically engineered plants that do not require pollination or artificial ecosystems that can maintain themselves without insects could become the norm. These technologies, however, would alter the very fabric of life on Earth, transforming natural systems into managed ones. Such a future would raise ethical questions about the relationship between humans and nature, and whether technology could or should replace natural processes. Ultimately, while humans possess the ingenuity to innovate and adapt, the absence of insects would fundamentally alter life on Earth in ways that are difficult to predict. The reliance on technology, the restructuring of societies, and the adaptation of ecosystems would mark a new chapter in human history, one where humanity stands as the sole architect of its environment, for better or for worse. Insects are more than tiny creatures buzzing around us. They are the hidden architects of life on Earth, from pollinating the crops we rely on, to maintaining the delicate balance of ecosystems, to processing waste and preventing the spread of disease. Insects play essential roles that touch nearly every aspect of our existence. Their absence would initiate a cascade of irreversible changes, transforming the natural world and reshaping human society in profound ways. Reflecting on the interconnectedness of life reveals the fragile balance that sustains us. The ecosystems we depend upon have developed over millions of years, shaped by countless interactions between species. To lose any part of this intricate web, let alone an entire class of creatures like insects, would unravel the very systems that support us, highlighting our own vulnerability. It's a humbling reminder of the vast and complex relationships that govern life on Earth and the vital importance of preserving these connections. So, what do you think? Could we adapt to a world without insects, or are they truly irreplaceable? If this video has prompted you to think differently about the world around us, we encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel. By joining us, you're supporting the exploration of nature's mysteries and the fascinating intricacies of life. Together, let's continue to understand, respect, and protect the world we share with all creatures, big and small.